The Trudeau government takes yet another stab at online control. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. A trend seems to be emerging here. If you've been paying attention to the news, the Trudeau Liberals are very interested in the internet. And to me, it seems like they're interested for all the wrong reasons. You have Bill C-10, then C-36, censorship, online hate speech, all these things, and we've covered those in previous episodes, so I do invite you to give those a listen. But today we're here to talk about the latest iteration, the Online Harms Bill. All of these recent bills and proposals have a certain core scope. They're trying to extend the power of the government into the online space, and I do have many reservations about that. So, part of this new one, the Online Harms Bill, is the creation of a new regulator called the Digital Safety Commissioner of Canada. And they're going to be in charge of ensuring that online platforms remove illegal content within 24 hours of being flagged. And you can already spot where my first flag would come up. Remove illegal content. The government has been very slippery about how to define illegal content. It used to be quite clear, but when you have Trudeau mixing in subjective notions of hate speech into legal and illegal territory, that's where it becomes quite problematic, as we'll talk about in a second. So, according to the National Post, this new regulator would have power over services whose primary purpose is, quote-unquote, to enable users of the service to communicate with other users of the service over the internet. Okay, so basically everything on the internet, whether it's going to be the forum where people can respond and talk to each other, or social media, basically any of the most used services and websites on the internet are going to be subject to this. This is yet another perfect example of a broad, sweeping description that can be bent to fit any agenda once passed. So right now, the government, they could back off and say, well, that's the definition, but we're not going to exercise that freedom or exercise whatever this is, the self-appointed privilege on these websites here. Sure, they can promise you that, but once something passes that is so broad like that, they can redefine it at a whim, and they'll still be within the confines of the law. It's very important that with these bills and these proposals, that the language is accurate. And there is no wiggle room. Is the government seeking an overwhelming oversight into pretty much every online space populated with people who are communicating with each other, or are they focusing in on a few problematic ones? There's a big distinction there, and it's not too clear based on the way the bill is proposed. The government can say one thing, but the way the bill is being situated, it allows them the freedom to switch back and forth between objectives. Now, going further into the details of the bill, they have a couple of categories that they're going to be focusing on. The first thing that they'll be trying to review and crack down on is terrorist content. Further, the other category is content that incites violence. Then, of course, you have hate speech in there. Next is intimate images shared non-consensually, and child sexual exploitation content. Now, it's a mixed bag, and clearly, some of these things are, they have more merit than others. There's less to argue about with something like child sexual exploitation content. Something like that I'm all for the government getting serious about. I'm all for the government establishing a new commission, getting stricter about the criteria they impose on that, becoming more efficient in tracking it down. Sure, no issues whatsoever. But when the government takes something like that and puts it in the same category as hate speech, which we're seeing now as Trudeau has tried to redefine, can be something as simple as someone interpreting an offense, well, there's a lot of room between these two poles. Now, perhaps it makes sense to go through each of these things briefly. The first item is terrorist content. Here, we have to understand what exactly they mean by terrorist content. Are they talking about religious fundamentalist terrorist content, or are they talking about white supremacist terrorist content? Or are they misunderstanding what terrorist means and they're applying it to people who say things like F the government and revolutionary type speaking? I recall the Chinese government issuing a fine, or maybe it was imprisoning someone who refused to sing for the national anthem. To them, that was a terroristic thing. Not showing a national love for the anthem and being respectful to the Chinese Communist Party. Now, once again, you have the issue with vagueness here. One government's interpretation of terrorist content might not be the same as another, and it certainly might not be the same as the way you are thinking of it. This type of vagueness and flexibility is a mistake. You may like how Trudeau would interpret that word, but there's no guarantee that his predecessor and the one after that is going to provide you with a definition that you agree with, so why give them that privilege anyways to begin with? If you give the government a weapon or a tool, you better make sure it's not going to have fangs and points that can be pointed at you. Based on the way it's currently being defined, you may feel very comfortable, but take the example of China once again. These things can bend and morph and warp, and the easier you make it for that to happen, the more at risk you put not only yourself, but society. I would love for Trudeau to come forward and explain to us what his conception of terroristic means. Is it a terroristic thing for people to be burning down Catholic churches right now? That'd be an interesting conversation to have with him. I know he's been reluctant in some degree on that topic. Then we have the second item. It's content that incites violence. Actually, here I have less of an apprehension. This seems to make sense to me. You have to be directly inciting violence, though. Not some type of third-degree interpretation. If someone goes online and they're saying something like, kill this person, or go to this person's house and egg it, beat up these people, stuff like that, there really isn't room for that, and that's actually already covered in our laws. You can't incite to violence, it's not allowed. So here, to me, it seems to be a logical progression. This one I don't have too many issues about. Inciting to violence is always bad. Violence is not good, and having less of that seems to make sense to me. Now, this one seems to be more straightforward, but perhaps it's because I'm thinking about it in a rigid way, and the government has another conception. I'm not sure if that's likely the case, but inciting to violence is a very direct thing. It's someone literally telling you to do something violent. And here's the counterexample. If someone goes online and they say, I hate Trudeau, and someone goes out of their way then, after seeing that post, to punch him in the face, the person who put the comment out that they hate Trudeau, that is not incitement to violence. That's simply them expressing their opinion about Trudeau. They never called for you to go there and beat him up. That's not what was said. Now, the person who did punch him, they're going to be charged. It's going to be their fault. But take that example and flip it. If someone were to go online and say, hey, F Trudeau, we have to go and punch him in the face, otherwise something bad's going to happen. And then one of the followers of that person goes out and does it, that's more in line with the incitement to violence claim. Nobody should be doing that. They shouldn't be calling for violence. And as long as that distinction is preserved, you criticizing an institution or a person is not the same as inciting to violence. You talking badly about their ideas or even them as a character is not incitement. Only when you directly, literally call for violence, then you are inciting. If we can preserve that distinction, then this clause isn't too problematic in my opinion. Now, the third thing here is hate speech, and here there's a plethora of issues. I've talked about it ad nauseum at this point. There isn't too much more for me to add here. You already know what I'm going to say. It's a very subjective thing. The government gets to define that. Trudeau literally was trying to rewrite the definition and the scope of the law around hate speech last month. And he isn't the only one who can do that. His predecessor can do that. Maybe someone to the right of Trudeau would have a different idea of it. Maybe someone to the left of Trudeau would have a different concept of it. There's an infinite degree of understandings here. If I were to say something like the government is inept, we have to get the current leader out of power, bad things are coming, depending on what country I'm in, that could be considered something like hate speech. If I'm in China, then yes, for sure. They'd be saying it's hate speech, whatever, and they'd be locking me up. I don't think that's true for Canada, but it might not remain untrue forever. So once again, we get back to the question, why give the government that power to begin with? What type of benefit are you honestly expecting from this? Less toxicity online? Well, arguably, that will be a good thing in a vacuum. But here's the key. It's a price you pay for something like free speech, and this is the dynamic that we're looking at today. People would then say, well, why pay the price anyways? Why should we do that? Now, the answer is clear. Free speech is what enables you to truly be a free citizen. If you cannot freely question things and talk about matters without feeling undue pressures to not do it, you're simply a puppet of the regime. You're a puppet of wherever those pressures are coming from, and the balance of power is going to shift all in their favor. When the average person is too afraid to speak up and say whatever is on their mind when they're seeing something go wrong, the people doing the supposed wrong have all the chips in that regard. And it's a quick path to a dystopian society. Now, free speech is the tool that you can have to fight back against that. But it's not a perfect tool. People will use it in weird ways. People will get hostile. People will say mean things. That's true. In this dynamic here, there is no option where you don't pay a price. You're going to pay one either way. It's how you gauge the threats and put weight on them. To my eye, it's very clear. The pros and cons of having free speech far outweigh the pros and cons of not having it. If you don't agree with me, do a quick thought experiment. Think about all the places in the world right now where there is no free speech, like China and North Korea, and compare it to the places in the world where there is free speech, perhaps like America and Canada to a lesser extent. We actually have something called freedom of expression. It's not free speech per se, but it's pretty close. They're comparable. Now, take these two categories and see truly where in which is the citizen better off. And try and draw a link to the quality of life for the citizen and something like free speech and how places might be different with it and without it. Think about it and see what conclusions you draw based on that. Now, the next pillar of this bill. They're going to crack down on images shared non-consensually, and that's intimate images. Sure, that's fine. I have less of an issue about that. You have an angry ex who has a picture of you nude on their phone, and they're going to post it for revenge now because you broke up. That's not good. Sure, that's something that should be cracked down on. And finally, the child sexual exploitation content. No issues there. No issues whatsoever. And as you can see, the things that I do have problems with are the vague things, are the things that are subjective, and are the things the government has the ability to bend to benefit an agenda. The bill clearly is not all bad. I am very on board with getting more serious about these exploitation type content that's being posted. But the bill has certain things baked into it that do make it bad enough for me to be raising a concern. Now, the article does try to explain how exactly the government wants to define these things, and they say that while all of the definitions would draw upon existing law, including current offenses and definitions in the criminal code, they would be modified in order to tailor them to a regulatory as opposed to criminal context. So, there is interpretation, as we just talked about. And the government's going to be the one calling the shots there. The liberals have proposed things like new definitions of hate speech in that Bill C-36 that we talked about. That just illustrates the problem with hate speech laws again. The government can redefine them at literally any point because it's a truly subjective matter. And that is a definition of a slippery slope. You may want Trudeau to have that definition power, but you better think about the future. And who else may find themselves in power one day? If you're on the left side of the spectrum, think about if you would want someone like Donald Trump to have that power. And if you're someone on the right side of the spectrum, think about if you would want someone like Jagmeet Singh, Bernie Sanders, or AOC to have that power. I think when you zoom out and think about it in those terms, it becomes very clear that it's a undesirable dynamic to find yourself in. Now, the Digital Safety Commission would have inspection powers over communication services, allowing an inspector to enter at any reasonable time, any place in which they believe on reasonable grounds that there is any document, information, or any other thing, including computer algorithms and software, relevant to the purposes of verifying compliance and preventing non-compliance within the Act. So, interesting. Very vague here, too. Constitute or define to me reasonable time. Define to me reasonable grounds. And you really want to give regulators, these non-elected officials, that power to barge into private institutions, private property, and to seize things like algorithms, which are proprietary software to companies and stuff like that. And of course, it's a mixed bag once again. There are certain types of non-compliance that I would have less of an issue with. If you have strong evidence that a company, for some reason, has some of that child exploitation content on their software, and they're actually an evil company who is behind the scenes a mastermind in this industry, then sure, less of a problem there. But when you start dabbling into giving that type of power for something like a hate speech, then it becomes questionable. Then it becomes something that the government can use in a bad way. If these regulators have the power to barge into institutions because they're claiming that they're talking about quote-unquote hate speech, it's very similar to me to what China has, where their regulators, which would just be something like the military or the police, can barge into your institution because they think you're talking about hate speech and they'll shut you down. Really, it's mapped on almost perfectly. It's just the way that we think about it being used is different. But it doesn't have to be that way. It's the same type of core power, just we're a little bit more liberal about it. But we might not always be liberal about it. And further, the individual isn't even safe here either. Inspectors wouldn't be allowed to enter your home without consent or a warrant, but if they can get the consent or the warrant, then they can do it. That's pretty interesting to me. And once again, we have that mixed bag thing, where something like the exploitation content, I have less of an issue there. But when we're talking about things like hate speech again, that's a problem. To have a regulator, even with the remote possibility of barging into your house and doing what? Seizing your documentation, seizing your computer, scaring you. It's very interesting. And once again, it's the problem with this approach here, where they're putting a lot of things into one bill, where some things are not as opposable and some things very much so are. And you have to wonder why it was set up in this manner. Truly, each of these things to me deserves their own debate and their own bill and their own scope and their own law. They're not all on the same level. They're not all of the same magnitude. They have varying degrees of seriousness. This was a major fumbling, but maybe it was intentional. Maybe they knew that something like a regulatory body for hate speech would never be accepted, so they're going to smuggle it in to a regulatory bill that has a very serious topic in it, like exploiting children online. You know, it's very convenient to call the government fools and whatnot, but I do question that. This could have been a very tactical approach to smuggling in powers that otherwise would not have been allowed on their own. Now, let's say that you as an individual or you as a company owner are getting charged with something and you don't think it's fair. The government is going to be setting up this body called the Digital Recourse Council of Canada, and you'd go to this council to plead your case, basically. And the council is supposed to be here to provide independent and binding decisions on whether or not content does qualify as harmful, as defined in legislation, and it should be made inaccessible. Basically, it should be censored and taken off. So if the new commission flags you and they try to shut you down, then you can go to this council here, and then you can have your case heard. But once again, I do have questions here. Why to the council, this new council being built? Who's going to be a part of that? Who is going to be the one determining whether or not something is harmful content? Is the framework going to be something that the people have a say on? Or are they going to be lackeys appointed by Trudeau? Why not do something like go to regular courts? Why have this commission here on the side? Sure, they may want to alleviate some of the burden on the regular judicial system, but I do wonder who is going to be appointed. Who is going to be the one making those judgments there? Sure, you have the right to plead your case, but it all comes down to who's hearing it. Are they going to be impartial, or are they going to be biased? That's a clear thing that has to be sorted out here, and I don't feel confident that the government is going to ensure it's the best functioning institution. This here is a very strange bill that has some good things to it and some very bad things to it, and that makes it even more challenging to fight against, because there are always going to be those fools who say, hey, you're against that bill. Does that mean that you're against cracking down on exploitative content that targets children? And of course not. Nobody in their right mind is going to be against that, but that's not the only thing baked into this. And shutting down the bill as a whole does not mean shutting down each of the parts individually. As we talked about, some of these individual parts have much merit to them, but when you combine it with craziness, that's when a problem arises. And you have to be able to have that level of nuance to be able to pick apart the proposals, find what's good and find what's terrible, and then judge it as a whole. And as a whole, this bill, to me, is actually quite frightening. The scope and the power it gives to the government and these new regulatory bodies, it's something to keep your eye on. And I will be one of the early ones to flag if something problematic does arise here. So with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review online and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.